Hello, everyone. Welcome to the MoLab conversations on COVID, mobility, and well-being. Today, we will have a second series of conversation, and the topic today is a travel ban good idea? As we know, according to the legally binding document by the WHO, the International Health Regulations of 2005, each country is obliged to ask for permissions from the WHO before they stop international flights or they stop international trade. Otherwise, it will be regarded as a violation of international law. And of course, during this coronavirus pandemic, very few countries did that. And now just last week, I think on the 14th of May, a high-profile panel reviewed the WHO policies during the COVID pandemic, and they concluded that it is a bad idea, basically, to have this regulation. So in the next World Health Assembly that will take place at the end of May, it is very likely this legally binding international health regulation will be changed in this regard. This is a very curious and important question because the previous WHO regulation about the travel restrictions is based quite a lot of academic research, which shows that the travel restrictions do not help to obvious extent that in curbing epidemic. So I think we need a very serious re-examination and a serious debate about this. Is a travel ban a good idea? So today I'm very pleased and very grateful that the three friends of ours joined this conversation. They are all from the European University Institute and have done fantastic research on citizenship, mobility, and migration during the pandemic. And so the names are there: Lorenzo, Jelena, and the team. So first of all, today we had just a round table discussion. So I raise a question, so whoever wanted to jump in comments, and you please do so. So my first question is that about the general patterns of travel restrictions. What we have observed is that the travel restriction policies are very widespread, as documented by your research. All the beautiful chart shows that it is a global phenomenon, but yet at the same time is very uneven, right? Who is subject to this restriction and who is not is very different. So I wanted can you highlight some kind of unusual or interesting or surprising patterns that you have observed in terms of how this policy travels so fast from one country to another, become quickly globalized policy during the pandemic? I mean, is there any a particular driving force, or it is just purely due to the fact that the virus is spreading, so each country try to stop people from coming? Is there any patterns or dynamics there worth noticing? Yeah, Jelena?
If I can just say something briefly, and then I'll hand over to Tim and Lorenzo to actually reply to your question. What I think we have also tried to do with our CMMP data set is to, in a way, show that the travel ban in itself as a concept, it's not homogeneous. So you have different types of travel bans targeting different categories of, if you wish, visitors, travelers, persons, and also they have very, very different exceptions. Mm-hmm. So when we also try to talk about epidemiological effects of any sort of a policy that exists and restricts human mobility, I think we also have to have in mind the target of that policy, the scope of that policy, the ways in which it was implemented, and also who were those who were accepted from it. And now I think I can hand over to Tim and to Lorenzo to explain a little bit the dynamics and patterns that we have noticed in the course of our research.
I can give it the first go, Tim, and then we keep this conversation very informal because we haven't planned who is going to answer what, so we might even overlap at points. But yes, if you navigate our data, what you see, if you try to observe the global spread of different travel restrictions, is sort of a movement from east to west. Of course, the first restrictions were introduced in East Asia, which makes sense because there was the epicenter of what was then an epidemic. And then they moved west following the spread of the virus. So this is not surprising. But I think there are two qualifications to that. The first is that a few countries acted very fast and introduced travel restrictions of different sorts, as Jelena was saying, even before they recorded the first case in the country. And that is particularly the case of countries with very weak health services, which of course wanted to shield themselves and probably were more prudent than other countries. So especially in South America, I think Peru, Chile, they moved very fast. The second qualification is that in some regions of the world, especially in Europe, there was a bit of a wait and see approach. So countries were very reluctant to introduce international travel restrictions at first. But then once a couple of countries in that region introduce a restriction, then all the others follow very quickly. And so we have this sudden spread. And that's the case in Europe and possibly also in Africa. Now, this is all very preliminary because we have been busy collecting the data over the last 14 months. We keep collecting data now, and we still have to make sense. But I think these are some first observations. And perhaps Tim also wants to add something on this question.
Yeah, so just a small thought on the geographic variation and the countries that were maybe particularly quick to react. It strikes me that perhaps also small island states were particularly prompt in responding. So as if I remember correctly, the Marshall Islands was the first state to introduce a travel ban at all. And other small island states, I guess for obvious reasons, then use that as a way of trying to isolate their otherwise, I suppose, particularly vulnerable populations.
We had to smile as Tim was answering the question because this was a bit of a running joke of him having an obsession for small islands and overseas territories. So just, we were not poking fun at him while he was answering, but those are some inside jokes from our project.
Thanks for sharing with us the joke. Now, that's very interesting because a similar phenomenon is also observed within a country, right? Because the countryside, the poor areas, the remote places are the fastest to impose self-isolation. Because this is the only way for them to protect themselves. I mean, the people from the larger cities often laugh at these poor peasants of being overreacting and etc. But without a proper public health service, probably, by building walls against around your village is the only way that you can react to the pandemic. So this leads me to another question. When I mean, this is just my personal, as a layperson's observation. I notice that countries are very fast in doing, number one, repatriation. Once the outbreak took place in Wuhan, I noticed like the US and a few other countries, France, very quickly bring their citizens back to their home country, back to the home country, number one. Number two thing is that they ban people from this infected place from entering their territory. So they're kind of closing international borders. But they're much slower in imposing internal mobility restrictions, as you said, especially in Europe, it appeared to be very reluctant. So I don't know whether or not you have any comments on that. Why this is very, the closing international border. We know it won't work very well because really now we know at least to really suppress the spread of virus actually really comes from the internal mobility regulations. But that's probably related to the question about citizenship and different legal status. So the mixing of politics with medical concerns. Yeah. Any comments or thought about that?
If I may just say one thing on a piece of research that was done by two other colleagues of us, Paula Hofmeier-Zlotnik and Florian Rausis, who are also part of our team, because our team is between the EUI and the NCCR on the move in Switzerland. And what they do using the data set that we have, they compare restrictions to domestic mobility and restrictions to international mobility. And the timing of those restrictions, the moment where they are introduced and the moment when they are lifted. And what they find is that those restrictions are introduced pretty much at the same time. Actually, there is not a significant gap. But then restrictions to domestic mobility are lifted much more quickly than restrictions to international mobility, which tend to stay in place and become sticky. Then, of course, several countries, as we know, lift certain restrictions to domestic mobility and then reintroduce them. So it's kind of a much more flexible system once it enters into place. But again, international restrictions seems to be much more resilient over time. And I think that's an important takeaway point also more generally when we think of different ways of regulating mobility within and across countries.
Mm-hmm. And just to add a couple of insights from a paper that Lorenzo and I are working on at the moment on the actual, let's say, balance of citizenship in different situations. If you think about both evacuation and repatriation flights, and also the bans on other nationals to enter a particular country, those are all based on, let's say, those are all based on citizenship-based mobility rights, right? So the state has the duty to A, admit its own citizens, and B, to, in a way, protect them, meaning to evacuate them, etc. So this is one of the reasons why states were able also to be proactive in their efforts. And at the same time, there was this protective emphasis on the protective function of the state. And obviously it was done originally by border closures. Now, if you think about the regulation of internal mobility, rather than being a citizenship-based right, it's a universal human right, and it's also protected by a series of international conventions. So I guess that for the state to make this kind of a trade-off, there had to be a much greater argument. But as Lorenzo said, what we could see over time is a greater, let's say, I wouldn't perhaps call it flexibility, but the greater mutability of measures that are aimed at restricting internal movement, precisely because states need to take into account these broader human rights questions. I don't know if Tim has anything to add, as he's our in-house lawyer.
It's not so much a lawyerly point, but I was thinking this is more speculative, but I think perhaps also this sort of internal governance structure of a particular country perhaps also has a bearing on the kinds of internal restrictions that might be in place. Because it strikes me, sort of anecdotally at least, that countries with a federal or quasi-federal system of government are more likely to have restrictions between those subnational units. So here in Italy, the closures between internal regions have been quite a big part of the Italian response, whereas in the UK, which is at least not sort of doesn't traditionally see itself as a federal country, at least from a kind of English point of view. That's been much more controversial, and when it was suggested that there might be a border closure between England and Wales, that was seen to be some sort of constitutional crisis or something. So yeah, just to say that I think that also has impacted on that kind of variation.
Thanks. Absolutely. Actually, the internal and the international in this instance sometimes it's blurred, right? If you look at situation in Spain and Catalonia, there's a very strong argument from Catalonia to draw the boundary and stop movement. And also in Scotland, as Tim alluded to, the situation became quite politically sensitive. Then you have, country like China. China didn't go through national lockdown, but the local mobility restriction was basically introduced by the central government because the local government could not have that enough capacity to do that. And then in India, last year, there was a national lockdown introduced by the federal government, but then at the state level, local level, it was implemented differently, right? So that's, as Tim mentioned, I mean, that's real. It's a citizenship right, but the citizenship right itself is a very variegated phenomenon, right? So the national geo-body itself is really a complex creature animal, and this has become very obvious during this lockdown. So that's great. That's what lead to our next topic about the capacity of stopping mobility.